Most people have heard the name Oswald Spengler at some point without really stopping to think about what he was saying. He wrote a massive work in the early 1900s called The Decline of the West, and in it, he named 8 great civilizations that had risen and collapsed throughout recorded history: Babylonian, Egyptian, Chinese, Indian, Classical, Arabian, Western, and Mexican. 8. He wasn't guessing. He spent decades pulling this out of historical records, mythological texts, and patterns of cultural collapse. And the number he landed on matches something else, something much older, something written in clay before any of those 8 civilizations existed. The tablet in question sits in the University of Pennsylvania Museum under the catalog number CBS 10673. It came out of the ground during digs at ancient Nippur in the 1890s, part of a massive collection pulled from what was once one of the most important religious cities in Mesopotamia. For a long time, researchers paid attention to the sections that looked familiar: the flood passages, the references that seemed to echo Genesis. Papers got written, connections got drawn to the biblical story, and most scholars moved on. The opening section of the tablet, the portion that preceded everything else, remained largely overlooked throughout more than 100 years of academic scrutiny. That column is what changed everything, at least for the researchers willing to sit with what it actually said. A 2011 effort backed by the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative ran the broken marks through a database of over 90,000 other clay texts, cross-referencing signs and grammatical patterns that had no match in earlier translations. What they found was that the repeating structure wasn't decoration. It wasn't poetic filler the way earlier readers assumed. It was a numbered list. 7 entries, each one describing a world, a people, an ending. The Sumerians weren't writing mythology, they were keeping records. The implications of this discovery extended far beyond what initial analysis could capture. The researchers realized that earlier Sumerian scholars had been working with incomplete understanding, approaching the text through cultural assumptions rather than systematic linguistic analysis. The database cross-referencing process revealed patterns that human readers had consistently overlooked, subtle repetitions that only became visible when examined against the broader corpus of cuneiform writing. The breakthrough represented a fundamental shift in how scholars could approach damaged ancient texts. Instead of relying on educated guesses about missing sections or unclear passages, researchers could now map linguistic patterns across thousands of examples to reconstruct meaning with unprecedented accuracy. This methodological innovation would reshape Sumerian studies for years to come, demonstrating that careful computational analysis could unlock knowledge that centuries of traditional scholarship had failed to retrieve. According to those records, the first world was called Eridug. Not Eridu, the ancient city that shows up on the Sumerian king list, but something older, a city that even the Sumerians described as belonging to an age before their own, a time when the boundary between the divine and the human hadn't yet hardened into something fixed. The tablet describes Eridug as a place where knowledge flowed without restriction, where the Anunnaki moved among people rather than above them. Its end came not from war or flood, but from what the text calls, roughly translated, the breath of Anu, a fire from the sky that turned the land to glass. For a long time, that phrase was treated as religious language, poetic description of divine anger. During excavations that took place in 2004, researchers conducting a systematic soil analysis across southern Iraq made a remarkable discovery in materials collected at precisely the depth corresponding to approximately 29,000 BCE, a layer of glass-like material embedded in the dirt at exactly the depth you would expect for that time period. This type of material forms when sand is subjected to extreme heat and pressure at a scale too large for any known human process. The only natural mechanism that produces it in those quantities is a cosmic airburst, an asteroid or comet fragment detonating in the atmosphere with force comparable to a nuclear weapon. The layer sits right where the tablet said it would. The discovery prompted further investigation into the physical properties of this ancient glass layer. Scientists determined that the thermal signature matched what would result from an object entering Earth's atmosphere at extreme velocity, reaching temperatures that would turn sand into fused silica. The composition of the layer showed no contamination from human activity, no evidence of any technological process that could have created it. Geological surveys established that the layer appeared consistently across multiple sites in the region, ruling out localized phenomena or isolated impact events. The precision with which the tablet had identified both the nature and the location of this catastrophe began to shift how researchers approached the remaining sections of the text. If the first world's destruction could be verified through independent geological evidence, what did that suggest about the mechanisms described for the worlds that followed? The second world the tablet names is Bad-Tibira. The description here is detailed enough to be unsettling. A people built around metalwork and mining, pulling ore from the ground and shaping it into tools and objects that the Sumerians themselves described with words usually reserved for divine craftsmanship. Bad-Tibira's end came from below rather than above. The tablet describes what it calls the poison that rose from the earth. Water became undrinkable, crops collapsed. Animals either fled or simply died where they stood. The people didn't vanish in a single event. They deteriorated slowly across what the tablet measures as 3 human lifetimes. Volcanology has a specific term for this kind of event. A gas release event occurs when large quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and hydrogen sulfide escape from underground magma chambers through fault lines and fissures in the Earth's crust. The gases seep into groundwater, choke out root systems, and settle in low-lying areas where the air becomes unbreathable without any visible fire or eruption. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates sits on fault systems that have produced exactly these conditions. In 1986, Lake Nyos in Cameroon released a cloud of carbon dioxide that killed 1,700 people in a single night. That was a small event compared to what a sustained release across an entire region would produce over generations. The third world is Larik. The tablet describes its people as watchers of the sky, a civilization organized around the tracking of celestial movement. Their end comes in a passage the text calls the sky that fell. The sun disappeared for what the tablet measures as a full season. Stars shifted from their expected positions. When light returned, Larak was gone. Nothing remained to mark that it had existed. Climate scientists have a phrase for what the tablet is describing. A volcanic winter or impact winter happens when enough material is blasted into the upper atmosphere to block incoming sunlight for months or years. Heat drops rapidly across the entire planet. Plant growth stops. Food chains fracture from the bottom up. The Toba eruption in Sumatra roughly 74,000 years ago produced exactly this effect, shrinking the total human population down to somewhere around 10,000 individuals. That bottleneck is still visible in human DNA today. Every person alive carries the genetic signature of a near-extinction event that a civilization of skywatchers might have watched unfold without any way to explain it. The fourth world marks a change in how the tablet tells its story. With Shurupak and the others, the tablet opens with the people and then describes what killed them. With the fourth world, Ziusudra's city of Sippar, the tablet opens with the water, not a storm, not rivers breaking their banks. The ocean itself began to rise. Coastlines swallowed, cities near water consumed over the course of decades. The people the tablet calls a society of laws and ordered ranks scattered inland, but they never managed to rebuild the world they had known. Between 14,000 and 8,000 BCE, sea levels around the world rose by more than 120 meters as the ice sheets left over from the last glacial maximum melted and drained into the oceans. In certain periods, the ocean was climbing as much as 4 meters per century. The Persian Gulf, which now holds 30 meters of saltwater, was a river valley during the coldest stretch of the last ice age. Green land, habitable coastline, exactly the kind of place where earlier peoples would have built cities close to fresh water and fertile ground. Whatever they built there is now under the Gulf, at depths that have barely been surveyed. The rate of sea level change during this period would have been catastrophic for any civilization dependent on stable coastlines and predictable geography. Settlements that took generations to establish would have been underwater within the span of a human lifetime. Fishing communities would have watched their harvesting grounds transform into open ocean. Agricultural zones would have shifted inland year by year, making long-term planning impossible. The fifth world is Shurupak itself, the city the Sumerians linked most directly to their own flood traditions. But the tablet's version of Shurupak's end doesn't follow the familiar shape of the flood story. The ancient text makes reference to the advancing glacial mass, a cold front that obliterated entire regions and forced human populations to migrate southward in its path. The cold came first, then the advancing ice. Then, only after the ice began retreating, the floods that followed from all that meltwater releasing at once. The sequence is specific. It describes a complete glacial cycle, not a single catastrophic inundation. Later civilizations collapsed that entire sequence into the simpler story of one god, one flood, one ark. The sixth world is the one that researchers find hardest to place. The tablet names it Kiangi, which is the Sumerian term that identified Sumer as a place. Yet this isn't the historical Sumer. The tablet is explicit that this is a version of Sumer that came before the one its writers knew, an earlier draft of the same civilization that rose, organized itself around trade routes and city networks, and then was destroyed by something the text calls the sickness that could not be seen. People fell ill, seemed to improve, and then never recovered. The sickness traveled along trade roads, moving as if it lived in the goods being carried from city to city. This is a precise description of how epidemic disease spreads through connected trade networks. The Black Death followed the Silk Road across Central Asia into Europe. Smallpox arrived in the Americas aboard European trading vessels. A pathogen moving through a pre-Sumerian trading system would create exactly the geographical pattern the tablet describes, jumping along routes of commerce rather than spreading outward in even circles from a single point. And there is physical evidence in the ground. Burial sites in southern Iraq dating to the period before historical Sumer show mass. Interment events. Multiple bodies placed together with no signs of violence. The pattern matches what archaeologists find at sites associated with large-scale epidemic death. The seventh world has no name. That section of the tablet is too damaged to read the identifying marks with confidence. But its end is described in more detail than any of the previous 6. The tablet calls it the turning of the Earth's heart. The Earth quaked relentlessly for what the Sumerians measured as 40 days. Water sources reversed their flow. The stones that travelers used to navigate stopped pointing north. Mountains that had stood without change collapsed, and new elevations rose where flat ground had been. Even the stars appeared to shift in the night sky. Earth's magnetic field does not stay fixed. It drifts, weakens, and periodically reverses as the North Pole shifted to where South had been and the South Pole moved to where North had been. The last full reversal, called the Brunhes Matuyama event, happened roughly 780,000 years ago. But partial events, periods when the field drops to a fraction of its normal strength without fully flipping, occur far more frequently. The Lachamp excursion roughly 41,000 years ago reduced Earth's magnetic field to about 5% of its standard strength. At that level, charged particles from the sun reach the surface without the usual shielding. Navigation by magnetic stone becomes useless because the poles are no longer where they should be. The aurora, normally confined to regions near the poles, would have been visible across the entire sky at all latitudes, distorting the appearance of the constellations in ways that would have been terrifying and inexplicable to any people relying on stars to measure seasons and direction. After laying out all 7 endings, the tablet shifts. The Anunnaki are described watching the sequence of collapsed worlds and drawing a conclusion. Not that humans were inherently broken or morally deficient. The conclusion was about the planet itself. Earth was a place that periodically reset. Fire from above, poison from below. Ice, flood, plague, magnetic collapse. The planet didn't need human failure to destroy what lived on it. It destroyed things on its own schedule for reasons that had nothing to do with the choices any civilization made. The Anunnaki's response to this, according to the tablet, was to create the Tablets of Destiny. The Tablets of Destiny appear throughout Sumerian writing in different contexts. Usually they are described as instruments of divine power, objects whose possession gives the holder control over fate itself. Myths involving Zu the Stormbird stealing them from Enlil or Inanna's descent to the underworld being linked to their ownership treat them as weapons of cosmic authority. CBS 10673 describes them differently. Not as tools of control, but as tools of preservation. A record of everything that went wrong across 7 previous civilizations, assembled with the specific purpose of surviving any future disaster, and giving the 8th world access to what the 7 before it had learned through their deaths. That reframing matters. In the standard reading of Sumerian mythology, the Tablets of Destiny are about power over the universe. In CBS 10673, they are about memory across extinction events. The distinction changes the entire shape of the Sumerian divine world. The Anunnaki in this tablet aren't rulers handing down law from above. They're archivists who have watched 6 civilizations die before the 7th fell too, and they're trying to solve a problem they haven't been able to solve across an enormous span of time. When Oppenheimer watched the first nuclear test detonate over the New Mexico desert in 1945, he quoted from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He wasn't reaching for a dramatic phrase at random. The Hindu texts he was drawing from contained descriptions of weapons called Brahmastra, divine arms capable of ending all life on Earth. Weapons whose use was considered the ultimate transgression against the natural order. The parallel he was drawing, consciously or not, runs directly toward what CBS 10673 describes as the fate of the 8th world. The tablet's description of how the 8th world ends is the section that makes researchers reluctant to discuss it in formal papers. The ending assigned to our civilization is not an asteroid or a gas release event or a magnetic collapse. The tablet calls it the fire that humans make. The text says the eighth world discovers the power hidden inside the smallest pieces of matter, learns to break that power open, and builds from it weapons capable of ending everything. The Sumerian term used is gishbaral, which translates word for word as the great fire weapon. That word appears in other Sumerian texts, but always in connection with divine actors. CBS 10673 is the only known clay text where gishbaral is held by human hands. The tablet doesn't describe this as a triumph. It doesn't treat the discovery as the peak of human achievement. It treats it the way a doctor treats a patient who has found a way to make the same fatal mistake that killed the 6 patients before him. The Anunnaki are described debating what to do. Some argue for direct intervention. Others hold that the pattern cannot be broken, that every world that reaches a certain point of development eventually finds the means to destroy itself and then uses it. The argument goes back and forth across several lines of damaged text, and then the tablet simply stops. Whether it stops because the clay broke, because the scribe ran out of space, or because whoever wrote it chose to leave the ending unresolved is something no one has been able to determine. The University of Pennsylvania holds the fragments. Researchers have examined every edge. There is no indication of a missing continuation tablet. There is no companion piece that picks up the debate. The Anunnaki's argument over whether the eighth world can be saved was either never finished or never recorded. The tablet ends in the middle of a sentence, at the moment when the outcome was still uncertain, and it has stayed that way for roughly 5,000 years.